Margaret Thompson stood at the train station platform, clutching a worn leather suitcase and a crumpled letter that had changed her entire life. The year was 1923, and the dusty town of Millbrook stretched before her like a promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. At 32, she knew she was older than most women who answered mail-order bride advertisements, but desperation had a way of making even the most unlikely choices seem reasonable. The letter in her hand bore the careful handwriting of William Harrison, a rancher who claimed to need a wife to help run his property and care for his aging mother. Their correspondence had lasted 6 months, filled with polite exchanges about daily life, favorite books, and dreams for the future. William had seemed kind in his letters, describing his modest ranch and promising a comfortable life together. He had never asked for her photograph, which Margaret had taken as a good sign. Most men seeking mail-order brides were quite particular about appearance. Margaret's journey to this moment had been anything but easy. After losing her parents to influenza 3 years earlier, she had struggled to maintain their small boarding house in Chicago. The economic troubles following the war had made it nearly impossible to keep paying tenants, and creditors had begun circling like vultures. When her neighbor Mrs. Peterson showed her the matrimonial advertisement in the newspaper, Margaret had initially laughed at the suggestion. But as the bills piled higher and her options dwindled, the idea of starting fresh in a new place with a decent man began to seem less ridiculous. She had been honest about her age in their letters, or so she thought. When William wrote asking about her years, she had replied that she was in her early 30s, which wasn't exactly false, though it wasn't completely forthcoming either. Margaret had convinced herself that once they met and got to know each other, her age wouldn't matter. She was still attractive, with auburn hair and green eyes that people often complimented. More importantly, she was hardworking, could cook and sew, and had experience managing a household. The train conductor called out the final boarding announcement for passengers continuing west, jolting Margaret from her memories. She looked around the platform one more time, hoping to spot someone who might be William Harrison. He had written that he would meet her at the station, describing himself as tall with dark hair and wearing his best brown suit. Several men milled about the platform, but none seemed to be looking for anyone in particular. As the minutes ticked by, Margaret began to worry. Perhaps William had been delayed, or maybe she had misunderstood the meeting arrangements. She approached the station master, a kindly older gentleman with spectacles perched on his nose, and inquired about transportation to the Harrison Ranch. His face immediately brightened with recognition. "Oh, you must be the bride William's been expecting," he said with a warm smile. He was here earlier but had to step away on urgent business. His ranch hand, Tom Mitchell, is supposed to collect you. Let me see if I can spot his wagon. Relief washed over Margaret as she followed the station master outside. A weathered wagon pulled by 2 horses waited near the building, driven by a man who appeared to be in his 40s. He had kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put her at ease. Tom Mitchell introduced himself with a respectful tip of his hat and helped load her belongings into the wagon. During the 40-minute ride to the ranch, Tom regaled Margaret with stories about the area and William's family. He spoke highly of his employer, describing him as fair and hardworking, though perhaps a bit particular about certain things. The ranch, Tom explained, had been in William's family for 2 generations and was known for producing some of the finest cattle in the region. William's mother, Mrs. Harrison, was a formidable woman who had run the household with an iron fist since her husband's death 5 years earlier. As they traveled the dusty road leading to the ranch, Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The landscape was beautiful, with rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and the distant mountains creating a majestic backdrop. This was so different from the crowded, sooty streets of Chicago. She could imagine building a peaceful life here, away from the noise and chaos of the city. The Harrison Ranch came into view as they crested a small hill. It was larger than Margaret had imagined, with a substantial 2-story house, several outbuildings, and endless pastures stretching toward the horizon. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and she could see men working near the barns. Everything looked prosperous and well-maintained, exactly as William had described in his letters. Tom pulled the wagon up to the front of the house, where a woman emerged onto the porch. Mrs. Harrison was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, dressed in black with her gray hair pulled back severely. Her expression was unreadable as she watched Margaret climb down from the wagon. Behind her stood a tall man with dark hair who could only be William Harrison himself. Margaret's heart raced as she approached the porch. Smoothing her traveling dress and checking that her hair was still neatly pinned, this was the moment she had been both anticipating and dreading during the long journey west. William stepped forward, and she could see him taking in her appearance with what seemed like growing concern. "Miss Thompson?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and wasn't particularly pleased about it. "Yes, Mr. Harrison. I'm so pleased to finally meet you," Margaret replied. Extending her hand and offering her warmest smile, William hesitated before taking her hand briefly. His mother moved closer, her sharp eyes examining Margaret from head to toe like she was evaluating livestock at market. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Margaret realized that something was very wrong with this reunion. "I'm afraid there's been some sort of misunderstanding," William finally said, glancing nervously at his mother. "You're not quite what we were expecting." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. "I don't understand. We've been corresponding for months. You know everything about me?" Mrs. Harrison stepped forward, her voice cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. "Everything except the most important detail, it seems. You're far too old to be suitable for my son. We were expecting someone young enough to bear children and work hard for many years. You've clearly misrepresented yourself." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had traveled hundreds of miles, spent nearly all her remaining money, and burned her bridges in Chicago, only to be rejected before she'd even had a chance to prove herself. The injustice of it made her angry, but she forced herself to remain composed. Margaret stood frozen on the porch, feeling the weight of 3 pairs of eyes judging her. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, making her traveling clothes stick uncomfortably to her skin. She had imagined this moment so many times during her journey west, but never like this. Never with such cold rejection, before she'd even had a chance to speak properly with the man she'd traveled so far to marry. "I was honest about my age in our correspondence," Margaret said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "I told you I was in my early 30s. William shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her direct gaze. "Perhaps there was some confusion in our letters. We assumed you meant 22 or 23 at most. A woman of 32 is hardly in her early 30s. Mrs. Harrison snorted with disdain. "Early 30s indeed. You look every bit of 35 to me, possibly older. My son needs a young wife who can give him children and work alongside him for decades to come. You're practically at the end of your childbearing years." The cruelty in the older woman's voice made Margaret flinch. She had faced hardship before, but never such calculated meanness from strangers. Tom Mitchell, who had been unloading her luggage, stopped what he was doing and watched the scene unfold with obvious discomfort. Several ranch hands had also gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the raised voices. "Mother, perhaps we could discuss this inside," William suggested weakly, finally showing some sign of embarrassment at the public nature of their rejection. "There's nothing to discuss," Mrs. Harrison replied firmly. "This woman has come here under false pretenses. The kindest thing we can do is send her back on the next train to wherever she came from." Margaret felt tears threatening, but she refused to cry in front of these people. She had survived the death of her parents, the loss of her home, and countless other hardships. She would not crumble now, no matter how devastating this rejection felt. "I understand your disappointment," she said, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster, "but I have nowhere to return to. I sold everything I owned to make this journey. Perhaps we could come to some arrangement. I could work for you as a housekeeper or cook until I figure out what to do next." William's mother laughed harshly. "We have all the help we need, thank you very much. Besides, having a discarded mail-order bride hanging around would be an embarrassment to our family's reputation in the community." "Now hold on just a minute," a new voice interrupted from behind them. Everyone turned to see Tom Mitchell stepping forward, his hat in his hands but his expression determined. "Mrs. Harrison, with respect, this lady has come a long way in good faith. Surely we can show her some Christian kindness." Margaret was surprised by his intervention. The ranch hand had seemed quiet and deferential during their ride from the station, but now he stood tall and spoke with quiet authority. Mrs. Harrison's eyes flashed with anger. "Tom Mitchell, you forget your place. This is a family matter and none of your concern." "Maybe so, ma'am, but turning away a woman with nowhere to go doesn't sit right with me." Tom replied steadily, "Miss Thompson, if you'll allow me, I know some folks in town who might be able to help you find temporary lodging while you sort things out." William finally found his voice again, though he still couldn't meet Margaret's eyes directly. "That's very generous of you, Tom, but I'm afraid we can't take responsibility for Miss Thompson's situation. She should have been more forthcoming about her circumstances." Margaret felt a surge of anger at his cowardice. In his letters, William had seemed like a man of character, someone who would stand by his word and treat others fairly. But faced with his domineering mother and an inconvenient situation, he showed himself to be weak and cruel. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I should have been more forthcoming. I should have told you that I'm 32 years old, not 22. I should have mentioned that I've run a boarding house for 3 years, managing finances and caring for difficult tenants. I should have explained that I can cook for 20 people, sew and mend clothing, tend a garden, and work harder than most women half my age." She paused, looking directly at William and then at his mother. "Most importantly, I should have told you that I was looking for a partnership, not just a convenient arrangement. I wanted to build something meaningful with someone who would value my experience and maturity, not dismiss me like a piece of damaged goods." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Even the ranch hands had stopped pretending to work and were openly watching the confrontation. Margaret realized that her outburst, while satisfying, had probably sealed her fate. But she felt better for having spoken her mind. Tom Mitchell cleared his throat. "Miss Thompson, if you'll permit me, I'd like to drive you into town and introduce you to some people who might be able to help. There's a boarding house run by Mrs. Cooper that takes in ladies in difficult circumstances. She's a good Christian woman who believes in helping others." "I can pay my own way," Margaret said quickly, not wanting to seem like a charity case. "I have a little money left, enough for a few weeks' lodging while I look for work." Mrs. Harrison stepped forward, her face stern. "Before you go spreading tales around town about how we treated you, I want you to understand something. We have a reputation to maintain in this community. It wouldn't do for people to think we're the sort of family that brings disreputable women out from the city." Margaret stared at the older woman in disbelief. Even in rejection, they were trying to control the narrative and protect themselves at her expense. "Ma'am," Tom interjected firmly, "Miss Thompson here seems like a perfectly respectable lady to me. I don't think anyone would consider her disreputable just because there was a misunderstanding about arrangements." William finally stepped forward, reaching into his vest pocket. "Perhaps we could help with your immediate expenses," he said, pulling out a small roll of bills. "To help with lodging until you can make other arrangements." Margaret looked at the money for a long moment. Part of her wanted to throw it back in his face, to reject their guilt offering with the same coldness they had shown her. But practical concerns won out over pride. She needed every dollar she could get if she was going to survive in this strange place long enough to figure out her next move. "Thank you," she said simply, taking the money without counting it. "I appreciate your assistance." Tom had already begun loading her belongings back into the wagon. As he worked, Margaret noticed some of the ranch hands watching her with sympathetic expressions. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, even tipped his hat respectfully when their gazes met. Perhaps not everyone in this place was as cold-hearted as the Harrison family. As the wagon pulled away from the ranch house, Margaret didn't look back. She had learned long ago that dwelling on disappointments only made them more painful. Instead, she focused on the road ahead and tried to imagine what possibilities might await her in the town of Millbrook. She had survived worse situations than this, and she would find a way to survive this too. The ride into Millbrook gave Margaret time to collect herself and think about her situation. Tom Mitchell proved to be a thoughtful companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the town's history, without pressuring her to talk about what had just happened. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they traveled the dusty road, and Margaret found the sound oddly comforting. Millbrook was larger than she had expected, with a proper main street lined with businesses and homes. She could see a general store, a bank, a church with a tall white steeple, and various other establishments that suggested a thriving community. People walked along the wooden sidewalks, going about their daily business, and several children played in a small park near the center of town. "It's a good town," Tom said, noticing her interest. "Folks here generally mind their own business, but they'll help a neighbor in need. Mrs. Cooper's boarding house is just up ahead there, the blue house with the white shutters." The boarding house was a neat 2-story building with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under the windows. It looked welcoming and well-maintained, exactly the sort of place Margaret might have chosen if she'd had the luxury of planning her accommodation in advance. Tom helped her down from the wagon and carried her suitcase to the front door. A plump, middle-aged woman with graying hair and a kind face answered their knock. She wore a simple but clean dress and an apron that suggested she'd been working in the kitchen. "Tom Mitchell, what brings you to town in the middle of the afternoon?" she asked with a warm smile. Then she noticed Margaret standing behind him, and her expression shifted to one of gentle curiosity. "Mrs. Cooper, I'd like you to meet Miss Margaret Thompson. She's had a bit of trouble out at the Harrison place and needs a room for a while, if you have one available." Mrs. Cooper's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't ask for details. Instead, she studied Margaret's face with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many women in difficult circumstances. "Of course, dear. Come in, both of you. I always have room for a lady who needs a safe place to stay." She stepped aside to let them enter, then called toward the back of the house. "Sarah, put the kettle on. We have guests." The interior of the boarding house was as welcoming as the exterior suggested. The front parlor was furnished with comfortable chairs and sofas, and Margaret could smell something delicious cooking in the kitchen. Everything was clean and orderly, but not so formal as to feel unwelcoming. A young woman appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked to be in her early 20s with dark hair and intelligent eyes. Mrs. Cooper introduced her as her daughter Sarah, who helped run the boarding house. "Miss Thompson, why don't you sit down and tell me what kind of arrangement you're looking for?" Mrs. Cooper said, settling into a chair across from Margaret. "Tom, you're welcome to stay if Miss Thompson doesn't mind." Margaret glanced at Tom, who had been nothing but kind to her since they met. "I don't mind at all. Mr. Mitchell has been very helpful during a difficult day." Over cups of hot tea and fresh cookies, Margaret found herself telling the whole story. Mrs. Cooper and Sarah listened without judgment, asking only clarifying questions when necessary. Tom occasionally added details about the Harrison family that helped explain their behavior, though he was careful not to speak disrespectfully of his employers. "I'm afraid this sort of thing happens more often than it should," Mrs. Cooper said when Margaret finished her story. "People have unrealistic expectations when it comes to mail order arrangements. They want perfection without being willing to offer the same in return." Sarah nodded in agreement. "We've had other ladies stay here who found themselves in similar situations. Usually things work out for the best, though it might not seem that way at first." Margaret felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Just being believed and treated with kindness was helping to heal the wounds left by her reception at the ranch. "I can pay for room and board," she said, reaching for her small purse, "at least for a few weeks while I look for work. I have experience managing a boarding house, so I know how to cook and clean and handle difficult guests." Mrs. Cooper waved away her reaching for money. "We'll settle the financial arrangements later. Right now, let's get you settled in a room, and then we can talk about what opportunities might be available in town." As Sarah showed Margaret to a small but comfortable room on the second floor, she shared more information about Millbrook and its residents. The town had a school that sometimes needed substitute teachers, several businesses that occasionally hired women for various tasks, and a growing number of families who needed help with housework and childcare. "There's also Mrs. Henderson at the millinery shop," Sarah added, as she helped Margaret unpack her few belongings. "She's been looking for someone with sewing skills to help with alterations and custom work. The railroad brings more people through town these days, and many of the ladies want fashionable hats and dresses." That evening, Margaret joined the other residents of the boarding house for dinner. There were 5 other women staying there, ranging in age from 19 to 60. Each had her own story of hardship or circumstance that had brought her to Mrs. Cooper's establishment. But the atmosphere around the dinner table was warm and supportive. Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 50s, had come to Millbrook to be near her only surviving son. Miss Emma, barely 20, was a schoolteacher who had taken a position in the local school. 2 sisters, Mary and Ruth, were seamstresses who had started their own small business making clothes for the town's growing population. The oldest resident, Mrs. Fleming, was a retired nurse who helped Dr. Williams when he needed extra assistance. "The wonderful thing about Millbrook," Mrs. Patterson explained as they shared a meal of roast chicken and vegetables, "is that people judge you by what you do, not where you came from. If you're willing to work and contribute to the community, you'll find your place here." After dinner, Margaret sat on the front porch with Mrs. Cooper and Sarah, watching the town settle into evening quiet. Lamps were being lit in windows and she could hear the distant sound of children being called in for the night. "I want to be honest with you," Mrs. Cooper said gently. "Life here won't be easy, especially for a woman on her own. But it's not impossible either. You seem like someone with backbone and common sense. Those qualities will serve you well." Margaret nodded, feeling more hopeful than she had since arriving in Millbrook. "I'm not afraid of hard work. In fact, I prefer it to sitting around feeling sorry for myself." Tom Mitchell appeared at the gate, having finished his business in town. He tipped his hat to the ladies on the porch and approached with his characteristic respectful manner. "Miss Thompson, I wanted to check on you before heading back to the ranch. Is everything satisfactory here?" "Very much so, thanks to your kindness," Margaret replied. "Mrs. Cooper and Sarah have been wonderful." Tom smiled, looking genuinely pleased. "I'm glad to hear it. If you don't mind me saying so, I think you'll do just fine here. Millbrook has a way of growing on people, and people here have a way of looking out for each other." As he prepared to leave, Tom hesitated for a moment. "Miss Thompson, I hope you won't judge all of us by what happened at the ranch today. There are good people in this area. People who understand that a person's worth isn't determined by their age or circumstances." After Tom departed, Margaret remained on the porch for a while longer, thinking about his words and the kindness she had already encountered in this small town. Perhaps her journey west hadn't been a complete disaster after all. Perhaps this was simply a different kind of beginning than the one she had planned. Margaret's first week in Millbrook passed quickly as she threw herself into finding work and establishing a routine. Mrs. Cooper had been right about the opportunities available for a woman willing to work hard. By Thursday, Margaret had secured part-time employment at both Mrs. Henderson's millinery shop and the local hotel, where she helped with laundry and room cleaning. The millinery work proved to be particularly satisfying. Mrs. Henderson was a sophisticated woman in her 40s who had moved to Millbrook from San Francisco 5 years earlier. She appreciated Margaret's eye for detail and her experience with fine sewing, skills that were in high demand as more affluent families settled in the growing town. "You have an excellent understanding of what flatters different face shapes," Mrs. Henderson observed as Margaret worked on adjusting a hat for one of their regular customers. Many women think fashion is simply about following the latest trends, but true style requires understanding how to enhance natural beauty. The hotel work was less glamorous but equally important for Margaret's financial situation. The Millbrook Grand Hotel was the finest establishment in town, catering to traveling businessmen, families moving west, and the occasional dignitary passing through on railroad business. The manager, Mr. Patterson, was a fair employer who paid promptly and treated his workers with respect. Margaret found herself settling into a comfortable routine. She would spend mornings at the millinery shop, afternoons at the hotel, and evenings at Mrs. Cooper's boarding house, where she had quickly become part of the close-knit community of women. The other residents had welcomed her warmly, sharing advice about navigating life in Millbrook and introducing her to other members of the community. It was during her second week that Margaret first encountered Dr. James Williams at the hotel. She was cleaning rooms on the second floor when she heard raised voices coming from one of the guest rooms. A well-dressed woman was berating someone in harsh tones, and Margaret could hear a man's patient voice trying to calm the situation. Curious despite herself, Margaret slowed her cleaning to listen. The woman appeared to be refusing medical treatment for what sounded like a serious condition, while the doctor tried to explain the importance of following his recommendations. "I don't care what you say," the woman was saying. "I've been to doctors in San Francisco and Denver, and none of them could help me. I don't see why some small-town physician would be any different." "Mrs. Stanford, I understand your frustration," came the calm reply, "but the treatments available now are much more advanced than they were even 2 years ago. If you'll allow me to examine you properly, I believe I can help alleviate your symptoms." Margaret had finished cleaning the adjoining room and was gathering her supplies when the door opened and the woman stormed out. She was elegantly dressed but looked pale and drawn, clearly suffering from whatever ailment had brought her to seek medical attention. A moment later, a man emerged from the room carrying a black medical bag. He was perhaps 40 years old, with brown hair that was graying at the temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His clothes were simple but well-made, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "Excuse me," he said, noticing Margaret in the hallway. "Did you happen to see which way Mrs. Stanford went? I'm concerned about her condition and would like to speak with her once more." She headed toward the front staircase. Margaret replied. "She seemed quite upset." The doctor sighed. "Unfortunately, that's becoming a common reaction when people are frightened about their health. Thank you for your help." He started to leave, then paused and looked back at Margaret. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Dr. James Williams. Are you new to Millbrook?" Margaret introduced herself, and they talked briefly about her recent arrival and her work in town. Dr. Williams seemed genuinely interested in her background and made no reference to her age or marital status. His manner was professional but warm, and Margaret found herself at ease in his company. "If you ever need medical attention," he said as they parted ways, "my office is on Main Street next to the bank. I also make house calls when necessary." That evening, Margaret mentioned the encounter to her fellow boarders during dinner. Mrs. Fleming, the retired nurse, immediately began singing Dr. Williams' praises. "He's the finest physician this town has ever had," she declared. "Trained back east at a real medical college, not like some of these frontier doctors who learned everything from reading books. He's saved more lives in the 3 years he's been here than the previous doctor managed in 10. Sarah Cooper nodded in agreement. "He's also one of the kindest men you'll ever meet. Never charges people who can't afford to pay, and he's always willing to help with community projects. The ladies of the church have been trying to find him a suitable wife for years. But he seems completely devoted to his work. Perhaps he's just particular about what he wants in a wife," suggested Miss Emma, the school teacher. "A man of his education and standing probably has specific requirements." Margaret thought about the conversation later that evening as she sat on the front porch with Mrs. Cooper. The older woman had become something of a confidant, offering practical advice and emotional support as Margaret adjusted to her new life. "You seem thoughtful tonight," Mrs. Cooper observed. "Is everything all right with your work arrangements?" "Oh yes, everything is going well," Margaret assured her. "I was just thinking about what the others said regarding Dr. Williams at dinner, about how he hasn't found a wife despite the local ladies' efforts." Mrs. Cooper smiled knowingly. "Ah, I see. Are you perhaps interested in the good doctor yourself?" Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. "I wasn't thinking of myself specifically. It's just that after what happened with Mr. Harrison, I've been wondering what men actually want in a wife. Whether it's always about youth and beauty, or if some men might value other qualities. From what I've observed of Dr. Williams," Mrs. Cooper said thoughtfully, "he's not the sort of man who would be swayed by superficial considerations. He's seen too much of real life, dealt with too many serious situations. I suspect he would value intelligence, compassion, and strength of character above conventional attractiveness." Over the next few days, Margaret found herself thinking more about Dr. Williams and what Mrs. Cooper had said. She began noticing him around town as he made his rounds, visiting patients and conducting business. He always had a kind word for everyone he encountered, from the wealthiest banker to the poorest laborer. Children seemed particularly drawn to him, running up to say hello when they saw him on the street. Margaret's opportunity to interact with him again came when Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house fell ill with a severe cold that developed into something more serious. Mrs. Cooper was worried enough to send for Dr. Williams, and Margaret happened to be present when he arrived to examine the patient. She watched as he worked, noting his gentle manner with the older woman and his thorough approach to diagnosis. He asked detailed questions about symptoms and medical history, listened carefully to her breathing, and took her temperature with a precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. "It's bronchitis, but caught early enough that it shouldn't develop into pneumonia," he told Mrs. Cooper and Margaret after completing his examination. "She'll need to stay in bed for at least a week. Take this medicine 3 times daily and drink plenty of fluids." As he prepared to leave, Dr. Williams turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Cooper mentioned that you have experience caring for sick people. Would you be able to help monitor Mrs. Patterson's condition? I'd like someone to check on her regularly and send for me if her symptoms worsen." Margaret readily agreed, pleased to be trusted with such an important responsibility. Over the next week, she divided her time between her regular work and caring for Mrs. Patterson, following Dr. Williams' instructions carefully and noting any changes in the patient's condition. Dr. Williams visited Mrs. Patterson twice more during her recovery, and each time he spent a few minutes discussing her progress with Margaret. She found herself looking forward to these brief conversations, impressed by his dedication to his patients and his genuine interest in ensuring they received the best possible care. On his final visit, when Mrs. Patterson was clearly on the mend, Dr. Williams lingered longer than usual. He seemed to want to say something but appeared uncertain about how to begin. "Miss Thompson," he finally said, "I've been very impressed with how you've cared for Mrs. Patterson. You have excellent instincts for nursing, and you follow medical instructions precisely. Have you ever considered formal training in nursing or midwifery?" Margaret was surprised by the suggestion. "I've never thought about it seriously, though I did enjoy helping care for people when I ran my boarding house in Chicago. Is there a need for trained nurses here in Millbrook?" "There's a tremendous need," Dr. Williams replied earnestly. "I'm often called upon to treat patients in remote areas where I can't stay for extended periods. Having a skilled nurse who could provide ongoing care would make an enormous difference in patient outcomes." They talked about the possibility for several more minutes. Dr. Williams explained that he could provide training in basic medical procedures and patient care, supplemented by medical texts and journals. The arrangement would benefit both of them. Margaret would gain valuable skills and a more secure income, while he would have reliable assistance with his growing practice. "I would need to think about it," Margaret said. "I'm grateful for my current employment, and I wouldn't want to make any commitments I couldn't keep." "Of course," Dr. Williams agreed. "Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open whenever you're ready to discuss it further." That evening, Margaret found herself in the unusual position of having multiple people offering her advice about Dr. Williams's proposal. Mrs. Cooper thought it was an excellent opportunity that would provide both financial security and valuable skills. Sarah was excited about the possibility of Margaret staying in Millbrook permanently. The other boarders were divided between those who thought nursing was an excellent profession for an unmarried woman and those who worried about the propriety of a single woman working so closely with a bachelor doctor. "You must consider what people will say," warned Mrs. Fleming. Despite her own background in nursing, a man and woman working together in such intimate circumstances is bound to cause gossip, especially in a town this size. Miss Emma disagreed. "Dr. Williams is a respected member of the community. I'm sure people would understand that the arrangement is purely professional." Margaret listened to all the opinions but found herself most influenced by her own growing interest in medical work. The week she had spent caring for Mrs. Patterson had reminded her how satisfying it was to help people recover from illness. She had always been good with sick people, able to remain calm in difficult situations and attentive to their needs. Her decision was made easier by an incident that occurred the following weekend. Margaret was working at the hotel when a commotion arose in the lobby. A traveling family had arrived with a young child who was seriously ill, with what appeared to be a high fever and difficulty breathing. The parents were frantic and the hotel staff didn't know how to help. Margaret immediately took charge of the situation. She sent the desk clerk to fetch Dr. Williams while she helped the family to a room and began caring for the child. Using skills she had learned from caring for Mrs. Patterson and her own experience with sick boarders in Chicago, she helped lower the child's fever with cool cloths and positioned him to ease his breathing. When Dr. Williams arrived 20 minutes later, he found Margaret efficiently managing the crisis while keeping the parents calm and informed. Together, they worked to stabilize the child's condition, with Margaret anticipating the doctor's needs and following his instructions without hesitation. "You probably saved this boy's life," Dr. Williams told her quietly as they left the family's room. "Your quick thinking and proper care gave us the time we needed to treat his condition effectively." Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction, unlike anything she had experienced in her other work. This was more than just earning money or keeping busy. This was making a real difference in people's lives. "Dr. Williams," she said as they walked back toward the hotel lobby, "I would like to accept your offer to train as a nurse. If you're still willing to teach me, I'm ready to learn." His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I'm delighted to hear that, Miss Thompson. We can begin whenever you're ready. I think you'll find it both challenging and rewarding work." They arranged to meet the following Monday to discuss the specifics of her training and how to balance it with her existing employment. Mrs. Henderson at the millinery shop was understanding about reducing Margaret's hours, especially when she learned the reason. Mr. Patterson at the hotel was initially concerned about losing a reliable worker but eventually agreed to a more flexible schedule. Margaret's medical training began in earnest the next week. Dr. Williams proved to be an excellent teacher, patient but thorough in his explanations. He started with basic anatomy and physiology, using medical texts and detailed diagrams to help her understand how the human body worked. Margaret discovered she had a natural aptitude for learning medical concepts and procedures. "You have an excellent memory for detail," Dr. Williams observed during one of their sessions, "and more importantly, you understand that medicine is as much about observing and listening as it is about technical knowledge." As weeks passed, Margaret found herself spending more and more time working alongside Dr. Williams. She learned to take patient histories, assist with examinations, prepare medications, and provide post-treatment care. The doctor trusted her with increasingly complex responsibilities, and she rarely disappointed him. The professional partnership was working well, but Margaret began to notice that their relationship was developing beyond mere colleague status. Dr. Williams often invited her to stay for dinner after long days, and their conversations ranged far beyond medical topics. They discussed books, shared stories about their pasts, and talked about their hopes for the future of medical care in frontier communities. Margaret found herself looking forward to these conversations as much as the medical work itself. Dr. Williams was intelligent, compassionate, and possessed a dry sense of humor that often caught her off guard. Unlike William Harrison, who had seemed intimidated by his mother's strong personality, Dr. Williams was confident in his own opinions while remaining respectful of others' viewpoints. One evening in late autumn, as they finished treating a rancher who had been injured in a fall from his horse, Dr. Williams made an observation that surprised Margaret. "You know, Miss Thompson, I've been thinking about how much my practice has improved since you began working with me. It's not just the additional help, though that's certainly valuable. It's having someone who truly understands the importance of what we do and shares my commitment to helping people." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I feel the same way, Dr. Williams. This work gives me a sense of purpose I never had before." "James," he said quietly, "I think we've worked together long enough that you could call me James, at least when we're not with patients." The use of his first name felt like crossing an important boundary, though Margaret wasn't entirely sure what that boundary represented. "All right, James, and you should call me Margaret." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the office door. Tom Mitchell stood outside, hat in hand and looking worried. "Doc, Miss Thompson, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but we need help out at the ranch. Mrs. Harrison has taken ill, and Mr. Harrison asked me to fetch you right away." Margaret felt her stomach tighten at the mention of the Harrison family. She hadn't seen William or his mother since that humiliating day at their ranch, though she occasionally heard news about them through Tom's visits to town. "Of course," James replied immediately, reaching for his medical bag. "What are her symptoms?" "High fever, terrible headache, and she's been vomiting all day," Tom explained. Mr. Harrison is beside himself with worry. As they rode toward the ranch in Tom's wagon, James filled Margaret in on what he knew about Mrs. Harrison's medical history. She was generally healthy for a woman her age, but had a tendency toward severe headaches that sometimes developed into more serious conditions. "I may need your assistance with this case," he told her. "Mrs. Harrison can be a difficult patient, and having another woman present might help her feel more comfortable." Margaret nodded, though she privately wondered how the woman who had rejected her so cruelly would react to seeing her return in a position of medical authority. She pushed those concerns aside, focusing instead on what she might need to do to help with the patient's care. The Harrison ranch looked different in the moonlight, less imposing than it had seemed on that bright afternoon months earlier. Lights blazed from the windows of the main house, and several ranch hands milled about in the yard, their faces reflecting concern for their employer's wife. William Harrison met them at the front door, his face drawn with worry. He looked older than Margaret remembered, and there were lines of stress around his eyes. When he saw Margaret, he stopped short, clearly not expecting her presence. "Miss Thompson," he said awkwardly, "I didn't realize you were still in the area." "Miss Thompson is my nursing assistant," James explained briskly. "She's an excellent medical professional, and I may need her help in treating your mother." William's expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been respect. "Of course, doctor. Please come in. Mother is upstairs in her room." Margaret followed James upstairs, her heart pounding with nervousness about facing Mrs. Harrison again. The older woman lay in bed, clearly very ill, her face flushed with fever and her breathing labored. When she saw Margaret enter behind the doctor, her eyes widened with shock. "What is she doing here?" Mrs. Harrison demanded weakly, struggling to sit up despite her obvious discomfort. "Mother, please," William said from the doorway. "Miss Thompson is here to help Dr. Williams treat you." "I don't want that woman anywhere near me, Mrs. Harrison insisted, though her voice lacked its usual strength. "She's probably here to gloat about my condition." James stepped forward with professional authority. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand you may have personal feelings about Miss Thompson, but right now my only concern is your health. She is an excellent nursing assistant and I need her help to properly examine and treat you." Margaret remained calm despite the familiar sting of Mrs. Harrison's rejection. She had learned during her medical training to separate personal feelings from professional responsibilities, and this was clearly a situation where her skills were needed regardless of past conflicts. "Mrs. Harrison," she said quietly, "I'm here only to help Dr. Williams provide you with the best possible medical care. Whatever happened between us before has nothing to do with your health." James began his examination while Margaret assisted, taking notes and preparing the equipment he needed. As they worked, it became clear that Mrs. Harrison was suffering from more than just a severe headache. Her symptoms suggested a serious infection that required immediate treatment. "We need to get her fever down quickly," James told Margaret quietly. "Can you prepare cool compresses while I mix a medication?" Margaret worked efficiently, demonstrating the skills she had learned over the past months. Despite her initial hostility, Mrs. Harrison began to relax as Margaret's gentle, competent care helped ease her discomfort. The cool compresses brought relief from the fever, and Margaret's quiet, professional manner seemed to reassure the anxious patient. Over the next several hours, Margaret and James worked together to stabilize Mrs. Harrison's condition. They took turns monitoring her vital signs, adjusting her medication and providing comfort measures. William remained nearby, clearly impressed by Margaret's medical knowledge and professional demeanor. As dawn approached, Mrs. Harrison's fever finally broke, and she fell into a peaceful sleep. James was confident that she had turned the corner and would recover fully with proper rest and continued medication. "You probably saved her life," William said quietly to Margaret as they prepared to leave. "I don't know how to thank you." Margaret looked at him steadily. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Harrison. This is my job, and I take it seriously regardless of personal circumstances." Before they left, Mrs. Harrison stirred and called Margaret to her bedside. The older woman looked exhausted but much more alert than she had during the night. "Miss Thompson," she said slowly, "I owe you an apology. My behavior when you first arrived was inexcusable. You've shown me nothing but kindness and professional skill tonight despite how poorly I treated you." Margaret was surprised by the admission, but responded with characteristic grace. "Mrs. Harrison, I appreciate your words, but what's important is that you're feeling better. Dr. Williams and I are simply glad we could help." Mrs. Harrison reached out and grasped Margaret's hand weakly. "You're a remarkable woman. I was wrong about you in every way that matters." During the ride back to town, James was unusually quiet. Margaret sensed he was thinking about something important but didn't want to interrupt his contemplation. The early morning air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the distant mountains. "Margaret," he finally said, "what happened back there was extraordinary. Not just your medical skills, though those were excellent, but the way you handled Mrs. Harrison's hostility and then cared for her with such compassion despite how she had treated you. That showed real strength of character." Margaret felt her cheeks warm at his praise. "I learned long ago that holding grudges only hurts yourself. Mrs. Harrison was sick and needed help. Nothing else mattered." "That's exactly what I mean," James continued. "You have a natural understanding of what it means to truly care for people. It's a rare quality and it makes you an exceptional nurse." They lapsed into comfortable silence for the rest of the journey. When they reached Mrs. Cooper's boarding house, James helped Margaret down from the wagon and walked her to the front door. "Margaret," he said, seeming to struggle with his words, "I hope you know how much I value working with you, not just as a medical assistant, but as a partner in this work we're doing." Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more carefully. There was an intensity in his expression that suggested he was talking about more than just their professional relationship. "I value our partnership too, James," she replied softly. "More than I can easily express." He stepped closer, and for a moment Margaret thought he might say something more personal. Instead, he simply touched her hand briefly and said, "Get some rest. You've earned it after the night we've had." Over the next few days, news of Mrs. Harrison's illness and recovery spread through Millbrook, along with stories about Margaret's role in her treatment. People who had previously known her only as the rejected mail-order bride began to see her in a new light. She was now recognized as a skilled medical professional who had proven herself under difficult circumstances. The change in how the community viewed her was most evident at church that Sunday. Instead of curious glances and whispered conversations, Margaret found herself greeted warmly by people who wanted to thank her for her service to the community. Several women approached her after the service to ask about medical concerns, clearly viewing her as a knowledgeable resource. Mrs. Henderson at the millinery shop noticed the change immediately. "You've certainly made quite an impression on people, my dear. I heard that Mrs. Harrison herself has been telling everyone how wonderful you were during her illness." Even more surprising was a visit from Tom Mitchell a few days later. He came to the boarding house specifically to see Margaret, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This is from Mrs. Harrison," he explained, handing her the package. "She asked me to deliver it personally and to tell you how grateful she is for everything you did." Inside the package was a beautiful silk scarf in deep blue, along with a handwritten note. Margaret read it with growing amazement. "Dear Miss Thompson, please accept this small token of my gratitude and respect. I have been thinking about our first meeting and how wrong I was about what truly matters in a person. You have shown me that character, compassion, and capability are far more valuable than youth or conventional beauty. I hope you will forgive an old woman's foolish prejudices and perhaps visit us again under happier circumstances. With sincere appreciation, Mrs. Eleanor Harrison." Margaret looked up to find Tom smiling at her expression. "She means every word of it," he said. "That woman doesn't apologize easily, but she's been talking about you nonstop since she recovered. I think you've changed her mind about a lot of things." That evening, as Margaret sat on the front porch with Mrs. Cooper, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that humiliating day at the Harrison Ranch. What had seemed like a complete disaster had instead led her to discover her true calling and earn the respect of the community. "You know," Mrs. Cooper observed, "I think everything worked out exactly as it was supposed to. If William Harrison had accepted you as his bride, you never would have discovered your talent for nursing or found your place in this community." Margaret nodded, fingering the soft silk of Mrs. Harrison's gift. "I'm beginning to think you're right. Sometimes what seems like the worst thing that could happen turns out to be exactly what you needed." As autumn turned to winter, Margaret's relationship with James continued to deepen. Their professional partnership had evolved into something more personal, though neither had spoken openly about their feelings. They spent long hours together treating patients, discussing medical cases, and sharing meals after particularly difficult days. Margaret found herself looking forward to these quiet moments as much as the exciting medical emergencies that tested their skills. The turning point came on a snowy evening in December. They had just finished treating a difficult case, a woman in childbirth who had experienced complications that required both of their skills to resolve successfully. Mother and baby were doing well, but the experience had been emotionally draining for everyone involved. As they cleaned up James's office afterward, Margaret noticed that he seemed unusually thoughtful. She had learned to read his moods over the months they had worked together, and tonight something was clearly weighing on his mind. "James, is everything all right?" she asked, setting down the medical instruments she had been sterilizing. He looked up from the patient notes he was writing, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression that she had never seen before. "Margaret, I need to tell you something," he said, setting down his pen and turning to face her fully. Over these past months, working with you has become the most important part of my life. Not just professionally, but personally. Margaret felt her heart begin to race, but she remained quiet, sensing that he needed to say whatever was on his mind without interruption. When I first came to Millbrook, I thought I would dedicate my life entirely to medicine, he continued. I believed that was enough, that helping people would fulfill all my needs for purpose and connection. But knowing you has changed that. He stood up and moved closer to her, his eyes never leaving her face. Margaret, you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Your intelligence, your compassion, your strength in the face of adversity, all of it amazes me every day. I've fallen in love with you, and I hope you might feel something similar for me. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, though they were tears of joy rather than sadness. James, I do feel the same way. I have for weeks now, but I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to say anything. Appropriate? James laughed softly, reaching out to take her hands. Margaret, there's nothing inappropriate about two people finding love while doing work they're passionate about. In fact, I can't imagine anything more perfect. He grew more serious then, searching her face carefully. But I need you to know that if you marry me, people will expect you to give up nursing. It's not considered proper for a doctor's wife to work so closely with her husband in medical matters. Margaret had been expecting this concern, and had already given it considerable thought. James, I understand the social expectations. But I also know that this community needs medical professionals more than it needs to follow outdated social conventions. We've proven that we work well together, and our patients benefit from having both of us involved in their care. Are you saying you'd be willing to continue working as my partner even after we're married? James asked hopefully. I'm saying that I can't imagine giving up this work any more than you could, Margaret replied firmly. If people object to a husband and wife working together in medicine, they'll have to get used to it. We're not doing anything improper, and the results speak for themselves. James smiled broadly, relief and happiness evident on his face. In that case, Miss Thompson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Margaret's answer was immediate and emphatic. Yes, James. I would be honored to marry you. Their engagement was announced the following Sunday after church, and the community's reaction was overwhelmingly positive. People who had witnessed their professional partnership and seen the results of their work together understood that this was a match based on mutual respect and shared values rather than mere convenience. Mrs. Cooper was delighted, immediately beginning to plan a wedding celebration at the boarding house. Sarah offered to make Margaret's wedding dress, and the other residents of the boarding house threw themselves into preparation with enthusiasm. Even Mrs. Henderson at the millinery shop insisted on creating a special hat for the occasion. Word of the engagement reached the Harrison ranch within days, and Margaret was surprised to receive another visit from Tom Mitchell, carrying a message from Mrs. Harrison. This time, the note was an invitation to visit the ranch so that Mrs. Harrison could offer her congratulations in person. Margaret and James made the trip together the following weekend, both curious about what Mrs. Harrison might want to say. They found her fully recovered from her illness and more welcoming than Margaret could have imagined. Miss Thompson, or should I say, the future Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Harrison said warmly as she greeted them in her parlor. I cannot tell you how pleased I am to hear about your engagement. William was also present, and he seemed genuinely happy about the news. Dr. Williams, you're getting an exceptional woman. I hope you know how fortunate you are. I'm very aware of my good fortune, James replied, squeezing Margaret's hand affectionately. Mrs. Harrison served tea and cake, treating Margaret with the respect and courtesy she had been denied during her first visit to the ranch. As they talked, it became clear that the older woman had done considerable thinking about her previous behavior and had reached some important conclusions. Miss Thompson, she said, during a quiet moment in their conversation, I want you to know that my son and I have discussed what happened when you first arrived. We both realize now that we were looking for all the wrong things in a wife and partner. She glanced at William, who nodded encouragingly. We were so focused on age and appearance that we completely missed the qualities that really matter. Intelligence, character, strength, and the ability to be a true partner in building a life together. William cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but determined to speak. Miss Thompson, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what my mother said during her illness. I was a coward that day, allowing myself to be influenced by superficial concerns instead of recognizing the remarkable woman standing before me. Margaret appreciated their apologies, but felt compelled to point out an important truth. Mr. Harrison, Mrs. Harrison, I understand what you're saying and I appreciate your honesty, but I think everything worked out exactly as it should have. If you had accepted me as a bride that day, I never would have discovered my calling as a nurse or found my true partner in James. She looked at James, who smiled encouragingly. Sometimes what seems like rejection is actually redirection toward something much better. I'm grateful that things happened the way they did. Mrs. Harrison reached across the table to pat Margaret's hand. You're very gracious, my dear. And you're absolutely right. You and Dr. Williams are perfectly suited for each other in ways that William and you never could have been. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Harrison made one final comment that touched Margaret deeply. Miss Thompson, I hope you'll allow me to attend your wedding. I would consider it an honor to witness the marriage of two people who have found such genuine love and partnership. Margaret and James were married on a bright January morning in Millbrook's small church. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by most of the town's residents and conducted by the local minister, who had watched their relationship develop with approval. Margaret wore a beautiful dress created by Sarah Cooper and the other women at the boarding house, and Mrs. Henderson's special hat completed her ensemble perfectly. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to Mrs. Cooper's boarding house, where tables had been set up in the parlor and dining room. Tom Mitchell had driven in from the ranch specifically for the occasion, and even some of the Harrison ranch hands attended to offer their congratulations. Mrs. Harrison presented Margaret with a beautiful set of medical instruments as a wedding gift, acknowledging both her new marriage and her continuing profession. For Dr. Margaret Williams, the card read, in recognition of her dedication to healing and helping others. As Margaret and James began their married life together, they established both their home and their medical practice in a larger building on Main Street. The ground floor served as James's office and examination rooms, while the upper floor became their living quarters. Margaret continued working as his partner, and their reputation as an effective medical team continued to grow. Within 6 months of their marriage, they were called upon to establish a small hospital in Millbrook, funded by the growing prosperity of the town and the recognition that professional medical care was essential for a thriving community. Margaret took charge of training other women as nurses, sharing the skills she had learned and helping to establish standards for medical care in their region. Years later, when people in Millbrook told the story of Dr. and Mrs. Williams, they always mentioned how their partnership had begun with Margaret being rejected as a mail-order bride. But rather than being a tale of disappointment, it had become a story about how true love and genuine partnership could emerge. From the most unlikely circumstances, Margaret often reflected on that humiliating day at the Harrison Ranch and marveled at how it had led to everything she treasured most in her life. She had found not just a husband, but a true partner who valued her mind, her skills, and her strength. Together, they had built something far more meaningful than a conventional marriage. They had created a life of service, love, and mutual respect that enriched not only their own lives, but the entire community around them. The mail-order bride who had been turned away for being too aged had discovered that her maturity, experience, and wisdom were exactly what she needed to build a truly fulfilling life. Sometimes, Margaret realized, the greatest gifts come disguised as the most painful rejections.